Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Man Who Carried Cash, Saul Holiff, Johnny Cash, and the Making of an American Icon by Julie Chadwick. Narrated by Susan Ericksen. Introduction. The story of Saul Holiff and Johnny Cash first arrived in my inbox as an email with the subject line marked Confidential. I was a cub reporter at my hometown paper in Nanaimo, British Columbia, and had also recently been promoted to editor of our weekly entertainment section, The Hub. In journalism, many a tall tale comes across one's desk, and part of the birth story of any piece begins with separating the wheat from the chaff. But unlikely as it seemed, this story was immediately compelling. The man writing to me was Jonathan Holiff, whose father, Saul Holiff, had officially worked as Johnny Cash's manager for 13 years. Before his death in 2005, at a time of his own choosing, as the subsequent obituary in the Globe and Mail had so eloquently put it, he had lived out his last years in Nanaimo. Since then, Jonathan had written, produced, and directed a documentary film about his father's life and relationship with both him and Johnny Cash, and was writing to me regarding the gala opening of the film that was about to take place in Nanaimo on his father's home turf. It was a story that held immediate intrigue, and in the years since, its grip on my imagination has only intensified. Following his father's death, Jonathan returned to Nanaimo from his home in Hollywood, where he worked in the world of celebrity endorsements as managing director of the Hollywood Madison Group. Overcome with conflicted emotions around his father's death, these feelings were soon exacerbated by the incessant calls of journalists who were curious about his father, as renewed interest in Cash swirled around the imminent release of the Joaquin Phoenix and Reese Witherspoon film Walk the Line. It seemed he couldn't escape the specter of his father. In the midst of this chaos, Jonathan's mother, Barbara, offered her son the key to his father's storage locker in the hope that, by going through his belongings, it would give him some form of closure. What it marked was the beginning of a multi-year journey of discovery for Jonathan, who, in his own words, was searching for his father in the shadow of a legend. What he found in the storage locker was a vast archive of materials his father had saved during his time as Johnny Cash's manager. As he waded through the archive, a picture began to emerge of a person he never knew, who was not only his father, but also Saul Holiff, a man personally possessed of a rich and troubled internal life, but who outwardly was a major figure in the history of Canadian and American music. The result was My Father and the Man in Black, a highly personal documentary that was as much about managers and superstars as it was about fathers and sons. When the film had its hometown opening, I was assigned to write the cover feature story on it. Over time, Jonathan and I began to discuss the possibility of a book that delved even deeper into the mystery of Saul Holiff, the man, and his career as manager to one of the legendary bad boys of American music. From the beginning, I could see that the material that Jonathan and the Holiff family had granted me access to was impressive. Saul was meticulous, a list maker, highly organized and fastidious both in appearance and in personal habits. This was reflected in the vast quantity and quality of the records he kept. Of particular significance was a large scrapbook of the type that was built to hold newspaper broadsheets, on the front of which were a series of gold letters, Liff, as though once intended to spell out Saul's last name. Perhaps the other letters had fallen off. However, on closer inspection, it could be seen that the final letter had been amended with a pen to become an E, so instead the letters read Life. Herein was Saul's own collection of newspaper cuttings, letters, and photos he found personally significant, and it provided a sort of key to the other materials within the archive. There were detailed financial records, contracts, audio-taped phone calls with cash, audio and written diaries, letters, posters, and hundreds of photos, both candid and professional. Many of the recordings and diary entries were recorded within hours, weeks, or months of events, which in turn served to inform the book on an as-it-happened level. Though fascinating and historically significant, it is also worth noting that Saul Holiff never intended for this archive to become public. In fact, up until his death, he was busy with liquidating much of it. Most of the gold records he had earned previously as Cash's manager had been sold or auctioned off to charity, and each year he would go down into the storage locker with a garbage bag to weed out items into the trash, with a promise to his wife that he would soon whittle it down to almost nothing. It is not known how much was lost in this process, but what survived is still considerable. Through the years, into his retirement, Saul toyed with the idea of writing a book about the entertainment industry and the quirky personalities within it, but a tell-all memoir about his famous clients like Johnny Cash was never his intention. He wanted to write something that would have served as a sociological study from an insider's point of view. Not only was it not his style to do a tell-all, but also, as a highly private individual like many men of his generation, Saul rarely, if ever, revealed the turmoil, pain, and insecurities that lay behind his facade of refined success, even to those closest to him. As such, I feel it is important to view his diaries and letters with a sense of reverence in that, though they paint a fascinating and complex portrait of a man and his tumultuous relationship with one of the most iconic figures in American music, they are also the very personal musings of a man who did not imagine that one day these thoughts would become public. Here, it might be worth making a note on style. Much, if not all, of Saul's thoughts that I have included are written in italics and come from Saul's own diaries or were stated in interviews. Though these are not in quotes, I attempt to stay as close to his own exact wording as possible. The scenes in the book are described as closely as possible to what factually transpired, with some minor allowances for creativity, and are based on newspaper clippings, quotes, diary entries, letters, and information from other books, but as with any scenarios based on memories, they often involve differing accounts. In some of these cases, I defer to Saul's perspective and descriptions, as until this point, his story has largely gone untold. It is also important to note that this book is not intended to be a definitive biography of Saul Holiff or of Johnny Cash, for that matter. There are far more qualified and intrepid writers who have shouldered the task of crafting Cash biographies with skill and nuance, and will continue to carry that story far into the future. This is, rather, the tale of a relationship between two men, in friendship and in conflict, and is as much a look into the world of music during the era of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, on both a personal and professional level, as it is a meditation on modern masculinity. Perhaps it is even a cautionary tale of sorts. What stood out for me as I researched these two men's entangled lives was that though they eventually achieved the outward success and triumph they so fervently sought, it did little to heal their internal strife. Therein lies a tragedy, but also, perhaps, a warning. I hope you enjoy the story of Saul Holiff and Johnny Cash. Prologue. The sun was setting as Saul Holiff crossed the living room floor, his shadow falling on the neatly packed bookshelves as he rounded the corner and entered his study. He looked trim in his tailored black slacks and cashmere sweater. His stride was smooth and purposeful. Despite his 79 years, he was in fairly good health, aside from a heart condition that was controlled with medication. Pulling a set of keys from his pocket, he unlocked the top drawer and pulled it open. He removed the kit from a small black leather bag and placed it on top of the desk. Methodically, he began to remove his jewelry and place it in the drawer. First, he slipped off the slim Piaget watch from his left wrist, then the thin gold wristband from his right. He struggled to loosen the wedding band that had been a fixture on his hand for 40 years. The wallet was last. He reached for the keys, just as he had done in every practice run. But something had changed. He studied the keys in the palm of his hand. Locking the drawer was pointless. He dropped them into the drawer and closed it. The curtain of dusk began to fall. As he returned to the living room, he flicked on a single lamp, which threw off just enough light to see. The leather sofa squeaked slightly as he sat. The kit he placed in the center of the glass coffee table in front of him. He went over his checklist. Sit in an upright position. Check. Eat a little food to prevent vomiting. Check. Drink a small amount of alcohol to augment the action of the drug. Check. He unzipped the kit and parted it against the surface of the table. A television flickered in the corner, but was silent. The bottle of pills clicked as he placed it on the table. He removed a black garbage bag and a large elastic band. He separated a number of gelatin capsules and lightly tapped their contents into a crystal glass, forming a mound of fine reddish powder. Using a long spoon, his actions measured, he mixed in a liberal amount of Stolichnaya, his favorite vodka, and topped it off with a splash of orange juice. Then he lifted the glass to his lips and drank its contents without stopping. The garbage bag lay beside him, edges rolled up carefully over the elastic band. This part he had practiced a number of times, unrolling and re-rolling the bag until it could be brought down over his face in one smooth action. His wife, Barbara, was on the couch next to him. He turned to meet her eyes and spoke his last words. "Remember what we agreed. You stay in the bedroom and don't come out, no matter what, until this thing is over." He pulled the bag over his head and filled it with air before quickly placing the large elastic band around his throat to create a seal. Barbara was in the bedroom when she heard the noise. Perched on the edge of her mattress, plucking at a stray thread on the bedspread, she raised her head at the sound, hoping she had just imagined it. Straining to listen over the pounding of her heart, it came again, a muffled shout. The third cry brought her to her feet. An instinct forced her out the door and into the living room toward the sofa. "Do not leave the bedroom, no matter what." His last words echoed in her mind. She froze. The Seconal, a fast-acting sedative used to calm patients before surgery, was beginning to hit his bloodstream in a vodka-enhanced flood. Barbara watched in horror as Saul's arms rose and lagged in the air. She wanted nothing more than to tear that wretched thing off his head, if only to stop the sound he was making, a sound that was now etched into her mind. She stood rooted to the carpet for a moment, her hands trembling, then turned mechanically and walked back into the bedroom. The lamp on her bedside table remained dark. She turned her wedding band around and around on her finger. "I promised I wouldn't interfere. If I revive him and he ends up a vegetable or maimed in some way, no, it is impossible. He would never forgive me." As night fell, the patches of silence in the living room expanded until their edges bled together seamlessly. It was over. It was March 17th, 2005. After what seemed like hours, Barbara emerged from the room. The slumped figure on the couch did not stir. She knew everything had to be left exactly as it was, so she touched nothing except to gently hold her husband's hand, already cooling to the touch. She remained there for a moment, feeling the tears on her cheeks. Then she slowly rose and called the police. 1. The White Coat. Two girls huddle in a modest wood-framed house in the village of Dmitrivka, not far from Ukraine's capital city of Kyiv. The shouts of men on horseback grow louder, and soon they hear the sound of hooves in the mud outside. Then the screams as the house next door erupts in flames. "It's time to run," their mother says in Yiddish, and throws each of them a coat, one white, one brown. The screen door claps shut behind them, and they tear off toward the cornfields that lie flat and green on the horizon. The youngest, Anne, sees the men on the horseback out of the corner of her eye as she runs. There are 7 or 8 of them. The sound of a gunshot cracks through the air. Her sister falls. Anne keeps running. For 4 days, Anne hides among the cornstalks with the other children, drinking cow's milk from a makeshift cup and subsisting on what grain and scraps are around until she can return home. Shchuncha, her older sister, survives, but not for long. The bullet wound in her stomach becomes infected. About a month after she was shot, she dies. "It could have been me," Anne said later. "It was the coats. They were accidentally switched. I got the brown one, she got the white one. There was only a 1.5 years difference between us, so either one would have fit. And that's when she was shot, because the white coat stood out." It was a sentiment also echoed by her aunt, who murmured, "Isn't it too bad that the beautiful child had to be taken?" when she thought Anne was out of earshot. Anne's father was an intellectual, she was told. He worked as an advocat, something like a lawyer. This made her proud. When the shadow of the First World War loomed, her father, Joel Holiff, was one of a flood of villagers who abandoned their dwindling shtetl to avoid being conscripted into the army. He left his homeland and traveled across the ocean to build a new life for his family in Canada, and his attempt to find work there was executed with single-minded determination. Not long after his departure, Jews in the Ukraine were pummeled by large-scale anti-Semitic pogroms and brutal raids that ground on in the lead-up to the Russian Revolution of 1917 and continued for years after. Tens of thousands of Jews were murdered by Bolshevik armies and Ukrainian nationalists. It would be almost 8 years before Joel's wife, Esther, and daughter, Anne, were permitted to join him in Canada. During that time, life for Anne and her mother was simply a matter of survival, as the sound of horses drove them, breathless, into hiding among the dusty feed bags. The fear of discovery hung dark over their days, like the sacking over the broken windows. The men would ride into the village and take over, stay a day or two, get drunk, rape and terrify the villagers, and then move on. Anne watched silently one afternoon as a man went into her house carrying a scythe and entered the bedroom where her grandmother lay dying. In a senseless act of cruelty, the man swept the weapon across the old woman's nightstand and sent all of her medicine bottles shattering to the floor. It was incomprehensible to Anne, who replayed the scene in her mind for years after. My grandmother didn't do any harm to him, she thought. She didn't even open her mouth. The underground shelters weren't much better. At first, they would make their escape carrying a few household items, uncertain how many days they would be gone or what would remain when they returned. However, their valuables were eventually all pillaged. The winters were so harsh, the cold gnawed into Anne's toes and made her bones ache. Anne's mother strained to quiet the noise of the little ones. She feared for herself also, as the attractive lines of her face and her long hair meant she was a target for the marauding men. Fear hung in the air, high and sharp, mingled with sweat and moldering damp. During one pogrom, more than 200 people crammed into the shelter. When one of the infants began to squall, Anne watched as a man took a pillow and wordlessly suffocated the baby so it wouldn't give them away. Anne helped out when she could, and stood guard at the cellar door to watch for military police while her mother made bootleg liquor in the basement and then hid it in the wall to later sell to the goyim. This, along with some sewing work, allowed Esther to provide for the children and her bedridden mother, as all the money Joel sent home from Ontario was confiscated by the Russian authorities. At least 3 times their escape plan seemed set, their passage guaranteed, only to have it unravel at the last minute when the Russians refused to let them leave. Finally, in 1921, with exit visas in hand, Anne and Esther boarded a train in Kiev destined for Hamburg. Thin and sickly, Anne tried to keep her strength up so she could pass the immigration examinations. At one station stop, Esther got off the train and went to find a pharmacy to get her daughter some medicine. On her way back along the platform, the train started to move. Anne, watching from the small train window, began to scream as she saw her mother break into a run. As she tried desperately to catch up to the train, her mother's long hair, held up with bone hairpins, started to fall. Just then, 2 men reached out and pulled her onto the train. Anne was in tears. She had nearly gone to Hamburg without her mother. While switching trains in Germany, an elegant woman approached Anne and Esther on the platform. "You have too much luggage to carry by yourself. Let me help you," she said with a smile. A moment later, they turned back to find she had disappeared, along with the 2 small bags containing all of Esther's valuables, purchased or bartered for through years of sewing and bootlegging. All that was left was their large wicker traveling trunk. My mother sat down and cried her heart out, Anne later remembered. She wanted to show her husband she wasn't exactly a pauper, that she earned monies herself. At Hamburg, they boarded the ship that would take them to Montreal. 3 weeks of travel across the roiling Atlantic Ocean followed, as the pair was packed in steerage with hundreds of retching passengers and nothing to eat but herring, sour cream, and onions. The entire boat was crawling with lice, and upon their arrival in Montreal, the immigration officials doused them in kerosene and roughly sheared their hair. Then came the medical examinations. I remember vividly about a dozen people were put on the small boat to go back to the big ship and be taken back to Europe because they had different diseases. We were fortunate. They let us through, said Anne. Free to leave, they were swallowed up in the push of bodies leaving the immigration hut. Struggling with their wicker luggage, they merged into the river of other passengers streaming onto the train station platform. A man, eyes searching behind circular-framed glasses, stood tall and immutable amidst the jumble of bodies, derby hat clutched in his hand. "This is your father," Esther said to Anne in Yiddish as they approached him. Husband and daughter stood staring at each other. Joel wore a double-breasted topcoat, all buttons, and underneath a vest and high-neck shirt. A tie was just visible, held down with a tiny sparkling pin. His face was smooth and inscrutable, though this moment marked the culmination of days that had run into weeks and months and years. Time had blended together in an endless ream of rolled-up rugs and sacks of dried goods hefted door to door. It was nights measured by the clink of his fork as he ended the day at Wong's Garden, the old Chinese restaurant on Richmond Street. It was the creak of springs as he fell into bed at the boarding house where he would later confess to his son Saul in a rare moment of intimacy. The woman who ran it once tried to lure him into a compromising situation. And here, now, on the train station platform was his child, a virtual stranger. Joel's arrival in London, Ontario in 1913 had been swiftly followed by news of the war, which clouded out all else except the grinding years of waiting and working. Cent by cent, the original $50 loan he had taken out was repaid, and dollar by dollar he trudged unwaveringly toward the goal of freeing his family. At first, he peddled goods on a bicycle. Then he moved to a horse and buggy until he scraped together enough money to purchase a panel truck. By the time he let his wife and remaining child out of the train station, it was to the open door of a convertible Essex automobile in which they drove to a trim little house on Rectory Street, which was furnished and complete with a wiggling bulldog puppy for Anne. Her old doll, fashioned from a linen kitchen towel, was replaced that day with a new one. Anne remained an only child for 2 years, until her brother Morris was born in 1923. 2 years after that, her mother came home from the Salvation Army Hospital across the street with a new baby they called Israel, and who later went by his middle name, Saul. The family soon moved from Rectory Street into a large apartment above the ladies' ready-to-wear shop they owned, where both parents toiled for 13 hours a day. Anne was left to raise the boys, who were both still in diapers. Serving as nursemaid and housekeeper, cooking, making formula from scratch, and washing diapers, 13-year-old Anne often resented the lack of choice in her position as second mother. She juggled this role alongside the adjustment to life in a new country, where her family members were dismissed.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?